The air in Charlottesville, Virginia, always seems to carry the scent of ancient oak trees and heavy expectations during the spring. You stood on the manicured lawn of the Turner estate, a place that breathed history and spoke of a lineage that traced its roots back to the founding of the state. It was the evening of the Turner Foundation's Grand Gala, a night meant to celebrate a legacy of charity and grace. But as you stood there, holding a glass of sparkling water you didn't want to drink, you realized that legacies are often built on the things people choose to forget. The music was a soft, classical arrangement that felt like it was trying to smooth over the jagged edges of the conversations happening beneath it. 500 people were gathered under silk-lined tents, their laughter ringing out like fine crystal hitting marble. You watched your daughter, Sarah, standing near the buffet table. She was wearing a dress of pale lavender, a color that used to make her eyes dance with life. But tonight, she looked like she was fading into the fabric itself. She was 32 years old, a woman who had once commanded a classroom of 25 energetic children with nothing but a smile and a firm word, yet now she seemed to be shrinking with every passing minute. Then it happened. It wasn't a scream, but it was loud enough to cut through the hum of the crowd. Evelyn Turner, the matriarch of the family and your daughter's mother-in-law, stood in the center of a circle of prominent guests. She was the picture of Virginian aristocracy, her white hair styled into a perfect crown, her pearls worth more than the small cottage you owned on the outskirts of town. She was looking at you, her eyes two chips of cold blue ice. You had simply stepped forward to offer Sarah a wrap, noticing the chill in the evening air. But Evelyn's hand shot out, not to touch you, but to signal a halt. Her voice was clear, ringing with a practiced authority that demanded silence from everyone within 20 feet. "Martha, dear," Evelyn said, her smile not reaching her eyes, "this is a private circle for the Foundation's primary benefactors. You are here to organize the library, not to mingle with the guests. You have no right to stand here." The world seemed to tilt. You felt the heat rise in your neck, a slow, burning shame that had nothing to do with your own actions and everything to do with the cruelty of hers. You looked at Sarah. Your heart broke when you saw her lower her head. She didn't defend you. She didn't look up. She simply took a step back, as if she were trying to become invisible. Mark, her husband, stood beside his mother, his expression one of mild discomfort. But he said nothing. He adjusted his tie and looked at his shoes, as if the grass were suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. You stood there for a heartbeat that felt like an hour. You were a woman of 68 years, a professional who had spent 4 decades preserving the fragile history of this state, and in one sentence, you had been reduced to an interloper. You didn't argue. You didn't cry. You turned around and walked toward the dark, quiet sanctuary of the main house, where the smell of old paper and leather waited for you. As you walked, you realized that your love for Sarah had been a kind of blindness. For 3 years and 7 months, you had watched this happen in small, quiet increments. You had seen the way Evelyn looked through her at dinner parties. You had heard the way Mark would sigh when Sarah expressed an opinion, as if her thoughts were a burden he was forced to carry. You had told her to be patient. You had told her that the Turners were a complex family with a long history. You had taught her that silence was a form of strength. But sitting in the dim light of the library, surrounded by the heavy silence of the archives, you finally understood the truth. Silence isn't strength when it's used to muffle the sound of someone's soul breaking. You began to think back to the day Sarah first introduced you to Mark. You remember the way she glowed. She had met him at a local bookstore where you both spent your Saturday afternoons. He was handsome, polite, and possessed a quiet confidence that seemed to offer Sarah the security she had always craved after your husband passed away. You wanted her to be happy so badly that you ignored the small red flags. You ignored the way he always checked his watch when you talked about your work. You ignored the way he never invited you to his mother's home for the first year of their relationship. You wanted to believe that your daughter had found a prince, so you looked away from the shadow he cast. Evelyn Turner was a master of a very specific kind of American cruelty. It wasn't the kind that left marks or involved raised voices. It was the cruelty of calculated indifference. She would plan family gatherings and forget to tell Sarah the dress code. She would talk about Sarah's career as a teacher as if it were a charming little hobby that she would surely outgrow once she became a real member of the family. She would praise other women in Sarah's presence, women with family names that meant something in the social registers of Richmond, and then look at Sarah with a pity that was sharper than any insult. For 3 years, you had been the observer. You had been hired by Evelyn to catalog the Turner family papers, a task you took on partly for the income and partly to be near your daughter. You had spent hundreds of hours in this library, a room filled with the ghosts of men who thought they owned the world. You had handled letters from the 1800s, ledgers from the Depression era, and diaries that whispered of secrets long buried. You knew how to find the things people tried to hide in the margins of their lives, but you had been so focused on the past that you had missed the tragedy unfolding in the present. You thought of the medical logs you had seen in the crates from the late patriarch's room. Evelyn's husband, Thomas Turner, had died 2 years ago. The official story was that he had passed away peacefully in his sleep after a long struggle with age-related decline. But as you sat there tonight, the memory of those logs began to itch at the back of your mind. You remembered the handwriting, shaky, desperate. Thomas had kept a journal during his final months. He had written about the fog that seemed to settle over him. He had written about how he would ask for his medicine, and Evelyn would simply look at him and say, "I already gave it to you, Thomas," even when he knew she hadn't. You realized now that Evelyn didn't need to be a villain in a movie. She didn't need to do anything dramatic. She just had to wait. She had watched her husband struggle with his memory, and she had chosen to do nothing. She had used his confusion to her advantage, guiding his hand as he signed documents that shifted $3,248,000 into accounts she alone controlled. She hadn't killed him. She had just stopped caring in a way that ensured his decline would be swifter and more profitable. And now she was doing the same thing to Sarah, not with medicine, but with her spirit. She was making Sarah doubt her own worth. She was gaslighting her into believing that she was lucky to even be allowed in the Turner house. And Mark was his mother's son. He didn't see the cruelty, because to him, it was just the way things were. He was a man who had been raised to believe that the feelings of others were secondary to the reputation of the name. You looked at the boxes stacked in the corner of the library. They were the private papers of Thomas Turner, the ones Evelyn had told you not to worry about yet. "Just focus on the historical documents, Martha," she had said with that thin, practiced smile. "The personal things can wait." But you knew that the personal things are where the truth always hides. You stood up and walked over to the first crate. Your hands were trembling, not from age, but from a sudden, cold clarity. You had spent your life protecting the dead, making sure their stories were told accurately. But tonight, you realized that the living needed you more. Sarah was out there on that lawn, being slowly erased by a woman who thought she was untouchable. And you, the woman who had been told she had no right to stand here, were the only one who held the key to the cage. You pulled out a leather-bound book. It was a ledger from 5 years ago. You began to flip through the pages, your eyes scanning the entries with the practiced speed of an archivist. You weren't looking for dates or names, you were looking for the gaps, the places where the money disappeared, the moments where the records didn't match the reality. As you worked, the sounds of the gala faded into the background. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, it all felt like a distant, shallow dream. Here, in the quiet of the library, was the reality. Here was the evidence of a life lived through calculated indifference. You found an entry from the month before Thomas died, a transfer of $700,000 to an offshore trust. There was no signature from Thomas, only a stamp that Evelyn had used on his behalf, claiming he was too weak to sign. You felt a sickening wave of realization. This wasn't just about money. It was about a pattern. Evelyn Turner maintained her world by removing anyone who challenged her or anyone who she deemed less than. She had done it to her husband, and she was doing it to you and your daughter. By telling you that you had no right to stand there, she wasn't just insulting you. She was asserting her ownership of the narrative. She was telling you that in the story of the Turner family, you were a footnote that could be deleted at any time. But footnotes are often the most important part of a text. They provide the context. They reveal the sources, and sometimes they hold the truth that the main body of the work is trying to hide. You thought of Sarah's face when Evelyn spoke, that look of absolute defeat. It was the look of someone who had been told they were nothing for so long that they had started to believe it. You had failed her by teaching her to be polite in the face of malice. You had failed her by telling her that the Turners were good people who just had high standards. You realized that your own desire for her to have a successful life had made you an accomplice in her misery. You had grown up in a small town in the Midwest, the daughter of a librarian and a carpenter. You were raised to believe that hard work and integrity were the only things that mattered. When you moved to Virginia and married your late husband, you felt like you had entered a different world, a world where who your grandfather was mattered more than what you did with your own hands. You had spent 40 years trying to fit into this society, trying to prove that you belonged among the elite by being the best at what you did. You had become the most respected archivist in the region because you were meticulous, quiet, and never caused trouble. But tonight, the woman who never caused trouble was gone. In her place was a mother who finally saw the monster in the garden. You reached into the bottom of the crate and found what you were looking for. It was a small, spiral-bound notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $1. It was tucked inside a heavy folder labeled Estate Tax Returns. It was Thomas Turner's personal medical log, written in his own hand during the final 3 months of his life. You opened it to the last page. The handwriting was a jagged crawl, as if every letter had been a struggle. "Evelyn stands in the doorway," it read. "She watches me reach for the water. I can't quite get it. She doesn't move. She just smiles. She told the doctor I am refusing to eat. I am not refusing. I am just so tired. She told Mark I don't recognize him. I see him. I want to tell him. But she is always there. She is the wall between me and the world." You closed the book. The silence in the library was no longer heavy. It was sharp. It was a weapon. You looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. The gala would be ending soon. The guests would be heading to their luxury cars, whispering about the unfortunate scene with the archivist. Sarah would be going home to a house where she was a ghost, and Evelyn would be sitting in her bedroom, sipping tea and feeling the satisfaction of a job well done. You tucked the notebook into your bag. You didn't feel like an interloper anymore. You didn't feel like someone who had no right to be there. You felt like a woman who had finally found the missing piece of a very long, very dark history. You walked out of the library and through the grand hallway. The house was quiet now, the staff busy cleaning up the remnants of the party outside. You saw Mark and Sarah standing in the foyer. Mark was talking to a man in a tuxedo, laughing about a golf game. Sarah was standing 3 feet behind him, holding her own coat, waiting to be told it was time to leave. She looked up when she saw you. For a moment, a flicker of the old Sarah appeared in her eyes, a flash of concern, of love. But it was quickly replaced by that dull, flat mask of endurance. "Mom," she whispered as you approached, "are you okay? I'm so sorry about earlier. Evelyn, she's just stressed with the event." You looked at your daughter. You didn't see a woman who was stressed. You saw a woman who was being dismantled, piece by piece, by the very people who were supposed to cherish her. "I'm fine, Sarah," you said, your voice steady and calm. "But you aren't, and that's going to change." Mark turned around, his smile fading into a look of polite annoyance. "Martha, look, about the gala. My mother has a lot on her plate. I'm sure she didn't mean it the way it came out. Let's just put it behind us, okay?" You looked at Mark Turner. You saw the expensive suit, the perfect hair, the easy charm. And beneath it all, you saw the calculated indifference he had inherited from his mother. He wasn't a bad man in the way the world defines it. He didn't hit her. He didn't cheat. He just let her die a little bit every day because it was easier than standing up to the woman who controlled his inheritance. "Mark," you said, leaning in so only he could hear, "I've spent the last 4 hours in the archives. I found some things that your father wanted you to know, things that weren't in the official report." Mark's face went pale. For the first time, you saw a crack in his armor. "What are you talking about?" "Not here," you said. And not now. But Sarah and I are going home to my house tonight. She needs a change of scenery." "She can't just leave," Mark stammered. "We have a brunch tomorrow with the senator." "She can," you said, taking Sarah's hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Sarah, come with me. Just for tonight." Sarah looked at Mark. She looked at you. You could see the internal struggle, the years of endurance fighting against the sudden terrifying hope of awareness. "Go ahead, Sarah," Mark said, his voice tight. "If your mother is being this dramatic, maybe it's best if you stay there tonight. I'll see you tomorrow." He turned back to his conversation, dismissing both of you with a wave of his hand. It was the same wave he would use to dismiss a waiter or a gardener. As you led Sarah to your car, you didn't look back at the Turner estate. You didn't look at the lights or the silk tents or the 500 guests who thought they were better than you. You felt a weight lifting off your shoulders, but it was replaced by a different kind of burden. The burden of knowing that the journey was only beginning. You were no longer just an archivist. You were a witness. And in the world of the Turners, a witness was the most dangerous thing you could be. You drove in silence through the dark roads of Virginia. Sarah leaned her head against the window, her eyes closed. You knew she wasn't sleeping. She was breathing in the air of a world where she didn't have to be perfect. "Mom?" she whispered after a few miles. "Yes, honey?" "Why did she say that to you? Why does she hate us so much?" You gripped the steering wheel. "She doesn't hate us, Sarah. People like Evelyn Turner don't have enough room in their hearts for hate. They only have room for themselves. She doesn't see us as people. She sees us as obstacles, or as tools." "I try so hard," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I do everything she asks. I've changed the way I talk, the way I dress. I even stopped seeing my friends because she said they were distractions from my duties as a Turner wife. But it's never enough. It's never, ever enough." "It will never be enough, Sarah," you said gently. "Because the goal isn't for you to be enough. The goal is for you to be nothing. That's how she stays in control." Sarah began to cry then, quiet, racking sobs that shook her entire body. You pulled the car over to the side of the road and held her. You didn't tell her it was going to be okay. You didn't tell her to be strong. You just let her feel the pain that she had been pushing down for 3 years. You realized that this was the pain phase of the mechanism, the realization that the life you thought you were building was actually a cage. But pain is the first step toward freedom. It is the fire that burns away the illusions. As you sat there in the dark, you thought of the notebook in your bag. You thought of Thomas Turner's shaky handwriting. He had been a man of immense power, a man who had shaped the state's history, and yet he had ended his life as a victim of a woman's quiet, calculated indifference. You wouldn't let that happen to Sarah. You wouldn't let her become another gap in the Turner family archives. "We're going to fix this, Sarah," you whispered into her hair. "But it's going to be hard. We're going to have to look at things we don't want to see. Are you ready for that?" Sarah pulled back and looked at you. Her face was tear-stained, her eyes red, but for the first time in years, she looked present. She looked like the woman who used to command a classroom with a smile. "I'm ready, Mom," she said. "I'm so tired of being invisible." You started the car and drove toward your home. You knew that Evelyn Turner was already planning her next move. You knew that she would try to use her money, her influence, and her son to bring Sarah back under her thumb. But Evelyn didn't know what you had found. She didn't know that the archivist she had insulted was no longer organizing her history. She was about to rewrite it. The moon hung low over the Virginia hills, casting long shadows across the landscape. You felt a strange sense of calm. You had lived your life in the service of the past, but tonight, you had finally decided to fight for the future. And as you looked at your daughter sitting beside you, you knew that no matter what happened next, you had already won the most important battle. You had given her back her right to stand. Your cottage on the edge of the woods felt like a different universe compared to the oppressive grandeur of the Turner estate. Here, the air didn't smell like expensive floor wax and old secrets. It smelled like cedar, dried lavender, and the damp earth of a Virginia spring. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, honey-colored rays across your kitchen table, you watched Sarah. She was sitting in the same chair she had occupied as a child, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. The silence between you wasn't heavy like the library's, but it was fragile. You could see the endurance still clinging to her, the way she flinched when a bird chirped outside, the way she kept checking her phone, expecting a command disguised as a request from Evelyn or a plea from Mark. 3 years and 7 months of being told she was less than had carved deep grooves into her psyche. You realized that taking her out of that house was the easy part. Taking that house out of her would be the work of a lifetime. You reached into your bag and touched the corner of Thomas Turner's spiral notebook. It felt hot, like a live wire. You hadn't shown it to Sarah yet. You weren't sure if she was ready to see the blueprint of the house she had been living in, a house built on calculated indifference. You thought about the $3,248,000 you had seen in the ledger. It was a staggering amount, but in the world of the Turners, it was just a number on a balance sheet. The real theft wasn't the money. It was the stolen years, the erased memories, and the quiet, systematic dismantling of a man's dignity. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't look up from her coffee. "Mark called 6 times while you were in the shower. He left a voicemail. He says his mother is distraught. He says she's worried about my mental state. He says I'm acting out of character." You felt a cold ripple of anger move through your chest. Distraught was the word people like Evelyn used when they were losing control. It was a tactical word, and acting out of character was the classic opening move of a gaslighter. By labeling Sarah's sudden spark of self-preservation as a mental lapse, they were already trying to build the walls of the cage again. "What do you think, Sarah?" you asked gently, pulling up a chair beside her. "Do you feel like you're acting out of character? Or do you feel like you're finally finding the character you lost 3 years ago?" Sarah finally looked at you. Her eyes were sunken, framed by dark circles that spoke of 1,000 nights spent wondering what she had done wrong. "I don't know who I am anymore, Mom. When I'm with them, I'm just a series of mistakes waiting to be corrected. I'm the one who talks too loud, the one who doesn't know which fork to use, the one whose family doesn't have a history." I started to believe that Evelyn was helping me. I thought her criticisms were a gift, a way to make me better. But last night, when she told you that you had no right to stand there, something broke. I saw the look on her face. It wasn't a look of concern. It was a look of triumph. This was the awareness beginning to take root. It was slow, agonizing, and devoid of the Hollywood drama people expect. It was the realization that your captor doesn't hate you. They just don't see you as human. You decided then to tell her. You couldn't protect her with silence anymore. Silence had been the very thing that allowed Evelyn to thrive. You placed the notebook on the table between you. "Sarah, I need you to read this. I found it in the archives last night. It belonged to Mark's father, Thomas. It's not a historical document. It's a witness statement." You watched her face as she read the shaky, desperate handwriting. You watched the way her breath hitched when she reached the part about Evelyn standing in the doorway, watching her husband struggle for water and doing nothing. You watched as she realized that the calculated indifference she had experienced was a family tradition. Evelyn hadn't just been strict or traditional with Thomas. She had been a predator of his vulnerability. When Sarah finished, she didn't cry. She looked at the book with a kind of hollow horror. "She did this to him? Mark told me his father was happy until the end. He told me his mother was a saint who never left his side." "Mark believes what he needs to believe to keep his world intact," you said. "He was raised in a world where the image is more important than the truth." Evelyn didn't have to be a monster to Thomas. She just had to step back. She just had to stop providing the care he needed and call it respecting his independence. It's a very clean way to hurt someone. No marks, no evidence, just a quiet decline that benefits the person holding the keys. You leaned forward, your voice dropping an octave. "And Sarah, that amount I told you about, the $3,248,000, it was moved out of his accounts while he was in that fog. While she was telling the doctors he was refusing to eat, she was using his signature stamp to move his legacy into her own name. She didn't just watch him fade away. She profited from every second of it." The sun was higher now, illuminating the dust motes dancing in your kitchen. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the woods. "I remember when Thomas died," she said, her voice flat. "Evelyn was so composed at the funeral. Everyone talked about her strength. They said she was a pillar of the community. I felt so guilty because I didn't feel that kind of strength. I felt small. I felt like I was failing Mark because I couldn't be like his mother." "That's exactly how she wanted you to feel," you said. "She uses her perfection as a weapon. If she is the standard, then anyone who is human, anyone who feels pain, anyone who makes mistakes, is automatically a failure. It's how she keeps Mark in line, and it's how she almost destroyed you." The morning passed in a strange, suspended state. You both knew that the Turners wouldn't just let Sarah go. In Charlottesville, a divorce wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a public relations disaster for a family like theirs. Evelyn would see Sarah's departure as a stain on the Turner name, and she would move heaven and earth to bleach it out. At 11 o'clock, a car pulled into your gravel driveway. It wasn't the heavy, silent limousine Evelyn preferred. It was Mark's SUV. He stepped out, looking rumpled in a way you had never seen. His shirt was untucked, and his hair, usually a masterpiece of precision, was windblown. He looked like a man who had spent the night trying to find a narrative that made him the hero, only to realize that he was just a spectator in his own life. Sarah didn't move from the window. You walked to the door and opened it before he could knock. "Mark," you said, your voice neutral. You were no longer the interloper from the Gala. You were the gatekeeper now. "Martha, please," Mark said, his voice straining with a forced politeness. "I need to talk to my wife. This has gone far enough. My mother she's very upset. She thinks she might have been too blunt last night, and she wants to apologize. She's even talking about hosting a lunch for you next week to make up for it." You looked at him and felt a sudden, sharp pity. He was still playing the game. He was still trying to use hosting a lunch as a solution for a shattered soul. He didn't understand that the currency of the Turners, the status, the invitations, the polite gestures, had no value here. "A lunch won't fix this, Mark," you said. "And your mother isn't upset because she was blunt. She's upset because for the first time in 40 years, someone didn't follow her script." Mark stepped onto the porch, his eyes searching yours. "Look, I know she can be difficult. She's from a different generation. She has high expectations because she cares about this family. Sarah knows that. We've talked about it 100 times. Sarah just needs to come home so we can talk this through like adults." Sarah walked out from the kitchen then. She stood behind you, her face pale, but her eyes remarkably clear. "I'm not coming home, Mark. Not today, and maybe not ever." Mark's face shifted from irritation to a kind of desperate confusion. "Sarah, honey, don't say that. You're just emotional. Last night was a lot. My mother, she has a way of being sharp when she's tired. But we're a family. We stand together. That's what being a Turner means." "No, Mark," Sarah said, her voice stronger than you had heard it in years. "That's what being a Turner means to your mother. To me, being a Turner has meant being silent. It's meant apologizing for things I didn't do. It's meant watching the person I love turn into someone I don't recognize because he's too afraid to tell his mother no." "I'm not afraid of her," Mark snapped, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "I just respect her. She's done everything for us. This house, my career, our future, it all comes from her." "And what did it cost, Mark?" you interjected, your voice low and dangerous. "What did it cost your father?" Mark turned his gaze to you, his eyes narrowing. "What is that supposed to mean? My father had a long, dignified life. He died with his family around him." "He died in a fog, Mark," you said, "a fog that was encouraged. I've seen the records, I've seen the medical logs, and I've seen the transfers. $3,248,000 moved while he couldn't even reach for a glass of water. Is that what you call dignity?" The color drained from Mark's face. He looked like he had been struck. You have no right to be looking at those things. Those are private family matters." "I was hired to organize the archives, Mark," you said, "and archives are where the truth lives. Your mother thought I was just a servant who would put papers in boxes. She didn't realize that an archivist's job is to connect the dots, and the dots I've found don't form a picture of a saintly widow. They form a picture of a woman who utilized her husband's decline to consolidate her own power. Mark shook his head, a frantic, repetitive motion. No, that's not true. My mother loved him. She took care of him every single day. You're just trying to twist things because you're angry about last night. You're trying to destroy my family. Your family was destroyed a long time ago, Mark, Sarah said, her voice filled with a profound sadness. It was destroyed the moment your mother decided that her control was more important than your father's peace. And it was destroyed every time you watched her belittle me and said nothing. You didn't just let her do it to me, Mark. You let her do it to us. Mark stood on the porch, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a child who had just realized that the monsters in the stories were real, and they were sitting at his dinner table. He didn't have a defense. He didn't have a counter-argument. He only had the hollow rituals of the Turner family, and they were failing him. "She's my mother," he whispered, as if that one fact could excuse everything. "And I was your wife," Sarah replied. "But you never treated me like I was part of your family. I was just an accessory, something to be managed, something to be corrected." She stepped back into the house, signaling the end of the conversation. Mark looked at you, his eyes wet with tears he wouldn't let fall. "Martha, please, don't do this. If this gets out, if people start talking, it will ruin everything, the foundation, the legacy, everything." "The truth doesn't ruin things, Mark," you said softly. "It just reveals what was already ruined. You have a choice to make. You can stay in that house and help your mother maintain the lie, or you can start asking the questions your father was too tired to ask. But Sarah is staying here. She's finally standing on her own ground." You closed the door. You heard Mark's footsteps on the porch, then the sound of his car starting and driving away. The silence that followed was different now. It was the silence of a battle lines being drawn. You went back to the kitchen and found Sarah sitting at the table, her head in her hands. You didn't say anything. You just put your hand on her shoulder and let her feel the weight of what had just happened. This was the awareness phase, merging into endurance. The realization was over. Now came the long, grinding process of dealing with the fallout. Over the next few days, the Turners shifted their tactics. The calculated indifference was replaced by a calculated campaign. Evelyn didn't call you, but she called everyone else. You started receiving calls from people you had known for decades, colleagues in the Historical Society, board members of the libraries you worked with. They all had the same tone, concerned, slightly patronizing, and clearly coached. "Martha, dear," one old friend said over the phone, "I heard there was a bit of a misunderstanding at the Turner Gala. Evelyn is so worried about you. She says you've been under a lot of stress lately, maybe some memory issues. She thinks you might have misinterpreted some old family papers. Perhaps it's time for you to take a long sabbatical. She's even offered to fund it." You sat in your study, surrounded by your own books, and smiled a cold, hard smile. Evelyn was moving fast. She was trying to discredit you before you could speak. She was using the same memory issues narrative she had used on her husband. It was her signature move. If she could make the world believe that the archivist was confused, then the evidence you found would be nothing more than the delusions of an aging woman. You didn't argue with your friend. You didn't explain. You simply said, "The papers speak for themselves, Helen, and my memory has never been sharper. But thank Evelyn for her concern. Tell her I'm busy working on a very special project." You realized then that you couldn't just sit in your cottage and wait for them to destroy you. You had to move. Not with a public scandal. That wasn't your way, and it would only hurt Sarah more. No, you had to move with the same quiet, lethal precision that Evelyn used. You had to use the archives against the woman who thought she owned them. You spent the next 72 hours going through the digital copies of the records you had made over the last 3 years. You looked for the patterns. You looked for the omissions. You found that the $3,248,000 wasn't the only transfer. There were dozens of smaller ones scattered over years, all timed with Thomas's most vulnerable moments. It was a masterpiece of financial erosion. But more importantly, you found the correspondence. Evelyn was a woman who loved to give orders in writing. You found emails to the estate lawyers, disguised as updates on Thomas's condition, where she subtly suggested that he was no longer capable of making decisions. You found notes to the household staff, instructing them not to let Mark see his father alone because it upsets him so much. And she had built a wall of care around Thomas that was actually a prison. And she was doing the same to Sarah. You found an email from Evelyn to Mark, sent just 3 months ago, where she discussed Sarah's lack of social stamina and suggested that perhaps she should be relieved of her teaching duties so she could focus on her health. Sarah had been wondering why her school principal had suddenly become so critical of her work. Now you knew. Evelyn had been whispering in the ears of the school board, using her influence to slowly pull the floor out from under your daughter's feet. She wasn't just trying to control Sarah, she was trying to isolate her so that the only person she could turn to was the Turners. You showed the emails to Sarah on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She sat in your study, the blue light of the computer screen reflecting in her eyes. As she read through the messages, the cold, clinical way her mother-in-law discussed her life as if she were a piece of faulty equipment, you saw the last of the endurance die. "She contacted my principal?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "She told them I was having a breakdown?" "She was preparing the ground, Sarah," you said. "She wanted to make sure that if you ever tried to leave, no one would believe you. She wanted to make sure you had nowhere to go." Sarah stood up, her face transformed by a cold, white-hot fury. It wasn't the loud anger of a tantrum. It was the quiet, settled anger of a woman who had finally seen the truth. "She thinks she's so smart," Sarah said. "She thinks because she has the name and the money, she can just rewrite people's lives. But she forgot one thing." "What's that, honey?" "She forgot that my mother is an archivist. She forgot that you know how to find what's buried." Sarah looked at you, and for the first time since she had married Mark, you saw the daughter you had raised, the woman who didn't back down, the woman who knew her own worth. "What do we do now, Mom?" You looked at the screen, at the cold, calculating words of Evelyn Turner. "We don't go to the papers, Sarah. We don't go to the police. Not yet. We go to the only thing Evelyn Turner actually fears." "What's that?" "The mirror," you said. "We're going to show her exactly who she is, and then we're going to walk away." You spent the next few days preparing a gift for Evelyn. You compiled a dossier, not of accusations, but of her own words, her own emails, her own ledgers. You organized them chronologically, a perfect historical record of calculated indifference. You included Thomas's drugstore notebook as the final chapter. It was a biography of a shadow, a record of a woman who lived in the gaps of other people's lives. On Friday evening, a week after the gala, you drove back to the Turner estate. Sarah stayed in the car. She wasn't ready to go back inside that house, and you didn't want her to. This was a task for the archivist. The gates opened silently as your car approached. The security guards recognized you. Evelyn hadn't officially fired you yet, likely fearing that doing so would look suspicious. You parked at the front of the house and walked up the stone steps. The maid opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and pity. "Mrs. Turner is in the drawing room, Martha. She wasn't expecting you." "I have some final papers for her to sign," you said, your voice calm and steady. You walked into the drawing room. It was a beautiful space, filled with sunlight and expensive art. Evelyn was sitting by the fireplace, a book in her lap. She looked as perfect as always, her pearls glowing in the soft light. She looked up when you entered, her expression shifting into a mask of polite disappointment. "Martha," she said, her voice like silk over glass, "I heard you were feeling unwell. I was so sorry to hear about your confusion at the gala. I hope you've been getting some rest." You didn't sit down. You walked over to the coffee table and placed the dossier in front of her. "I'm feeling much better, Evelyn," you said. "The confusion has cleared up remarkably well. In fact, I've managed to finish the cataloging of the Turner private papers. I thought you might like to see the final draft." Evelyn didn't touch the folder. She just looked at it with a mild, condescending curiosity. "I'm sure it's very thorough, Martha. But as I said, there's no rush. You should be focusing on your health." "Oh, I am," you said. "And so is Sarah. She's decided to take a permanent leave of absence from the Turner family. She's filing for divorce on Monday morning. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, the blue ice returning. Don't be ridiculous. Sarah is a Turner. She's just having a bit of a crisis. Mark will handle it. He's very patient. Mark can't handle the truth, Evelyn, you said. And the truth is right there in that folder. It's all there. The transfers from Thomas's accounts, the emails to the lawyers, the instructions to the staff. And most importantly, Thomas's own words about the woman who stood in the doorway and watched him die. Evelyn reached out and opened the folder. She began to flip through the pages, her face remaining perfectly calm. But you saw the way her fingers trembled as she reached the copies of the medical log. You saw the way the muscles in her jaw tightened. She looked up at you, her voice cold and flat. This is nothing. These are the ramblings of a sick man and some administrative errors. No one will believe this. I am a Turner. You are an employee. I am an archivist, Evelyn, you said. And I have already sent copies of these documents to 3 different historical societies and a private firm that specializes in elder financial abuse, not as a complaint, but as part of the historical record of the Turner family. It's amazing how much interest there is in the legacy of this house. The silence in the room was absolute. For the first time, you saw a crack in the saintly widow mask. You saw the fear beneath the pearls. What do you want? Evelyn whispered. Money? How much? You felt a wave of profound disgust. Even now, she thought everything had a price. She couldn't understand that some things, like a mother's love or a woman's dignity, were beyond her reach. I don't want your money, Evelyn, you said. I've seen what it costs to have it. I just want you to understand one thing. You told me I had no right to stand here, and you were right. I don't belong in a house built on silence and indifference, but neither does my daughter. And you turned and walked toward the door. You felt a strange, light sensation in your chest. The weight of the archives was gone. You'll never be one of us, Martha, Evelyn shouted after you, her voice cracking for the first time. No matter what you do, you'll always be a footnote. You stopped at the door and looked back at the woman sitting in her perfect room, surrounded by her perfect things and her absolute crushing loneliness. A footnote is where the truth is, Evelyn, you said. And the truth is that you're going to spend the rest of your life wondering who else knows. You walked out of the house and down the stone steps. You got into the car and looked at Sarah. She was looking at the house, her face calm and settled. Is it done? She asked. It's done, you said. The record is closed. You drove through the gates and out onto the open road. You didn't look back. You didn't need to. The Turner estate was a monument to the past, but you were driving toward the future. As the lights of Charlottesville faded behind you, you felt the awareness settle into a deep, quiet peace. This was the beginning of the emotional withdrawal. You weren't angry anymore. You weren't seeking revenge. You were just done. You were taking your daughter home. You were taking your archives home. And for the first time in 3 years and 7 months, you were both breathing the air of a world where you had every right to stand. The moon was high now, casting a silver glow over the Virginia hills. You felt a sense of clarity you hadn't felt in years. You were an archivist of the truth, and the truth had set you free. The morning after the final confrontation at the Turner estate, you woke up before the sun. In the stillness of your small cottage, the world felt vastly different. For 3 years and 7 months, your life had been calibrated to the ticking clock of someone else's expectations. But today, the only sound was the rhythmic breathing of your daughter in the guest room and the distant call of a mourning dove. You sat on your porch with a cup of tea, watching the mist rise off the Virginia hills, and you felt a strange, hollow peace. This was the beginning of the withdrawal, not a retreat in defeat, but a conscious stepping back from a world that had tried to consume you. You thought about Evelyn Turner. You had left her in that grand drawing room, surrounded by the physical evidence of her own calculated indifference. You didn't feel the rush of victory you thought you would. Instead, you felt a profound sense of exhaustion. You realized that justice, in its most honest form, doesn't always look like a courtroom verdict or a public shaming. Sometimes, justice is simply the act of removing your light from a room that doesn't deserve it. By handing over that dossier, you hadn't just exposed her. You had returned her own reflection to her. You had left her with the one thing she couldn't manipulate, the truth of her own soul. Sarah came out to the porch an hour later. She was wearing an old sweatshirt, and her hair was tied back in a messy knot. She looked tired, but for the first time, her face didn't have that frantic, haunted quality. She sat down in the chair next to yours and just watched the woods for a long time. There was no need for words. The archives of her marriage were closed, and though the inventory of the damage was still being taken, the fire had finally been put out. "I didn't check my phone once last night," Sarah said, her voice small but steady. "I left it in the kitchen. For 3 years, I slept with it under my pillow because I was afraid I'd miss a message from Mark or a suggestion from Evelyn. I thought being available every second was a sign of love, but it was just a sign of how much I had disappeared." You reached over and took her hand. Her skin was warm now, the icy chill of the Turner estate finally fading. "You didn't disappear, Sarah. You were just buried under a lot of history that wasn't yours to carry. Every archive has a section that needs to be moved to inactive storage. That's what we did last night." The next few weeks were a study in the quiet fallout. As you had instructed, you didn't seek out the local newspapers or call for a legal investigation into Thomas Turner's estate. You knew that the legal system in Virginia, especially when dealing with families like the Turners, was a slow, expensive machine that often crushed the victim a second time. Instead, you let the weight of the truth do its own work. The 3 different historical societies you had contacted were the real gatekeepers of the Turner legacy. In Charlottesville, social standing was built on the stories people told about your ancestors. By placing the records of Evelyn's indifference in the permanent historical record, you had effectively changed the Turner story forever. Evelyn's name began to vanish from committee lists. She wasn't arrested and she wasn't sued, but the calculated indifference she had used as a weapon was now being used against her. People simply stopped calling. The invitations to the garden parties and the charity boards quietly dried up. In that world, an unfortunate rumor was more lethal than a criminal charge. Evelyn was left in her grand house with her pearls and her silence, realizing that the walls she had built to keep others out were now keeping her in. She was the mistress of a kingdom of one. Mark called Sarah twice a week. At first, his messages were full of the same defensive rhetoric, blaming you, claiming Sarah was being unfair, and begging her to come back for the sake of the family image. But as the days turned into weeks, his tone changed, the bravado began to crack. You heard one of the voicemails while you were helping Sarah pack the last of her things from a storage unit. "Sarah," he said, his voice sounding thin and older than his 34 years. "The house is so quiet. My mother, she doesn't come out of her room much. People are asking questions at the firm. They're asking why the Foundation's audit is taking so long. I don't know what to tell them. I keep looking at the archives, trying to find where it went wrong. I realize now, I never really looked at you. I only looked at the person my mother told me you were." Sarah listened to the message and then deleted it. She didn't cry. She didn't call him back to explain. This was the most difficult part of the emotional withdrawal, the realization that you don't owe an explanation to someone who spent years refusing to understand you. "He sounds so lost," Sarah said as we drove back to the cottage. "He is lost," you replied. "But he's lost in a world he helped build. You can't be his compass anymore, Sarah. You spent 3 years trying to guide him, and all it did was make you lose your own way." You spent the month of May working together in your garden. There was something healing about the physical labor, the digging, the weeding, the planting of things that would grow on their own terms. Sarah had decided to go back to teaching, but not in the wealthy private schools Evelyn had preferred. She took a position at a small public school in the valley, a place where the children had messy faces and the parents didn't care about family names. She started coming home with stories about her students, about the boy who finally learned to read his first full sentence, and the girl who drew a picture of a tree with purple leaves because that's how she felt that day. You watched her bloom. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic transformation, but a slow, steady reclaiming of her own space. She started wearing bright colors again. She started singing while she cooked dinner. She started having opinions that had nothing to do with what was proper or refined. But the awareness within you remained sharp. You realized that your role as an archivist had changed. You were no longer just preserving the past. You were the guardian of the present. You had learned that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a lie, it's a partial truth. Evelyn Turner had lived her life telling a partial truth about her grace, her charity, and her family. You had simply provided the rest of the sentences. In early June, you received a final letter from the Turner estate. It wasn't from Evelyn or Mark. It was from a law firm, notifying you that your contract had been officially terminated. Attached was a check for the final month of work. Along with a non-disclosure agreement, they wanted you to sign in exchange for an additional severance package of $150,000. You sat at your desk, looking at the legal document. It was the last attempt to buy your silence. $150,000 to ensure that the historical records you had found stayed in boxes. It was a tempting amount for someone living on a modest pension, but as you looked at the paper, you felt a wave of calm. You didn't sign it. You didn't even keep the check. You folded the document into a paper crane, a skill Sarah had taught you years ago, and you placed it on the shelf next to Thomas Turner's drugstore notebook. You didn't need their money. You had already been paid in a currency the Turners didn't understand, the sight of your daughter laughing again. The final closure came on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had officially signed the divorce papers that morning. There was no grand drama in the lawyer's office, no shouting matches, just a quiet, clinical end to a period of endurance. Mark had agreed to everything Sarah asked for, which wasn't much, just her personal belongings and the right to walk away. He had even offered her a significant settlement, but Sarah had refused it. "I don't want their legacy, Mom," she had said. "I want to start my own." As you were driving back from the city, you passed the gates of the Turner estate one last time. From the road, it still looked perfect. The white columns, the rolling green lawn, the ancient oaks. It was a beautiful facade. But now, when you looked at it, you didn't feel the weight of its history or the sting of its rejection. You just saw a house, a big, cold house filled with things that didn't love anyone back. You realized that your own reflections had been the most important part of this journey. You had spent years believing that you had to be the bridge between Sarah and the world she had married into. You had thought that by teaching her to be quiet and patient, you were protecting her. But you had actually been training her to be a victim of the same calculated indifference that had destroyed Thomas Turner. You realized that your love had been a kind of blindness, you whispered to yourself, repeating the thought that had haunted you since the gala. By protecting her from every consequence, you had never taught her how to stand on her own. But she was standing now. That evening, you and Sarah sat on the porch as the fireflies began to dance in the grass. The air was cool and sweet. Sarah was grading papers for her new class, her red pen moving across the pages with a confident, rhythmic scratching. You were reading a book about the history of the Blue Ridge Mountains, finally reading for pleasure instead of research. "Mom?" Sarah said, looking up from a student's essay. "Yes, honey?" "Do you ever wonder if she regrets it? Evelyn, I mean. You thought about the woman you had seen in that drawing room, the woman who thought a severance package could buy back a soul. I think people like Evelyn Turner don't have regrets, Sarah. They only have losses. She doesn't regret what she did to your father or to you. She only regrets that she got caught. She regrets that her mirror is broken, but that's her burden to carry now, not yours." Sarah nodded slowly. "I used to wake up every morning wondering if I could be enough for her. Now I wake up and I don't even think about her. It's like she's a character in a book I read a long time ago. I remember the plot, but the story doesn't move me anymore." This was the ultimate withdrawal. The point where the person who hurt you no longer has the power to even be an enemy. They simply become a ghost in the archives. As you sat there, you felt a deep sense of moral awareness. You had seen the wrongdoing of a powerful woman, and you had chosen to act. You hadn't used her methods. You hadn't lied, you hadn't stolen, and you hadn't manipulated. You had simply used the truth as a boundary. You had shown that while the Turners might own the land and the buildings, they didn't own the history. History belongs to the people who are brave enough to remember it accurately. The quiet fallout continued in the town. Mark Turner eventually stepped down from the foundation's board, citing personal reasons. He moved to a smaller house in the city and kept a low profile. You heard through the grapevine that he was finally attending therapy, trying to untangle the knots his mother had tied in his mind. You hoped he would find his way, for his own sake, but you knew that he was no longer part of your daughter's story. He was a chapter that had ended with a very clear period. Sarah's school year ended with a small ceremony in her classroom. You went to watch. You saw her standing in front of those children, vibrant, strong, and deeply respected. One little girl came up and gave her a wilted dandelion, and Sarah accepted it as if it were a rare orchid. She looked at you from across the room and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and stayed there. You realized then that this was the closure you had been seeking. It wasn't about the Turners being punished, it was about Sarah being restored. You returned to your work at the Historical Society, but with a different focus. You started a project to document the lives of the unnamed people in the region's history, the laborers, the servants, the women whose names were often left out of the grand family ledgers. You became the archivist of the forgotten, making sure that the footnotes were finally given their due. One evening, as you were organizing your own personal files, you found the small, spiral-bound notebook you had taken from the Turner estate. You looked at Thomas Turner's shaky handwriting one last time. You thought about the man who had been trapped behind a wall of care. You didn't keep it. You didn't give it to the police or the papers. Instead, you drove to a quiet spot by the river, a place Thomas had mentioned in his early diaries as his favorite spot to fish as a boy. You sat on the bank and read the last few pages aloud to the water, giving his words the air they had been denied for so long. "I see the world," you read. "I am not a ghost. I am a man." Then you lit a small fire in a stone pit and you burned the notebook. You watched the pages turn to ash and disappear into the night sky. The evidence was no longer needed. The truth had already done its work. The cage was empty. As you drove back home to your cottage, you felt a lightness in your chest that you hadn't felt in decades. You were 68 years old, and you had finally learned the most important lesson of history, that the past only has power over you if you let it stay a secret. You arrived home and saw the lights on in the kitchen. Sarah was there baking a cake for a friend's birthday. The house smelled like vanilla and warmth. You walked in and she looked up, her face bright with a simple, uncomplicated joy. "Hey, Mom, you're late. I saved you the first piece." You sat down at the table and looked at your daughter. You looked at the life you had both built from the ruins of a perfect legacy. You realized that while you had spent your career preserving things that were old and fragile, the most beautiful thing you had ever restored was sitting right in front of you. You were no longer an archivist of the Turners. You were the author of your own life. And as you took a bite of the cake, you realized that the silence in the room wasn't empty at all. It was full of everything that actually mattered. The story of the Turners would go on, but it would no longer be your story. You had withdrawn your presence, your labor, and your daughter from their world, and in doing so, you had reclaimed your own. You had moved through the pain, endured the long winter of their indifference, found the awareness to see the truth, and finally, you had walked away into the light. And in that light, you were exactly where you had every right to stand. The archives were finally at peace, and so were you. The first anniversary of your departure from the Turner estate arrived with the same quiet dignity as the life you had built in its wake. Autumn had returned to Virginia, painting the hills in shades of copper, russet, and gold, colors that felt honest, unlike the artificial brilliance of the Gala lights you had left behind. You sat on your porch, watching the first leaves drift onto the driveway, and you realized that time doesn't heal everything, but it does provide a new lens. The sharp edges of the anger had worn down into a smooth, heavy stone that you carried not as a burden, but as a reminder of the price of your freedom. Sarah was nearly 8 months pregnant now. She moved through the cottage with a slow, rhythmic grace, her hands often resting on the curve of her stomach as if she were in constant conversation with the new life inside her. She had become a woman of substance, her voice no longer a whisper seeking permission, but a steady hum of intent. She still taught at the small public school in the valley, and her students had become a secondary family. They didn't know she was a former Turner. To them, she was simply Mrs. Sarah, the woman who believed their stories mattered. Your own work, the project on the unnamed, was nearing completion. You had spent the year digging through courthouse basements and church registries, finding the names of the people who had built the very foundations of Charlottesville but had been erased from the grand family histories. You were giving a voice to the footnotes, and in doing so, you were healing your own sense of displacement. You realized that your life had always been about the archives, but for 40 years, you had been protecting the wrong ones. The disturbance came on a rainy Tuesday in October. A black sedan, not the Turner limousine, but a professional town car, pulled into your driveway. You stood at the window, feeling a familiar tightening in your chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cool, detached curiosity. You were no longer afraid of what might step out of that car. It was Mark. He looked healthier than he had in months, his face fuller, the frantic exhaustion replaced by a quiet, subdued sobriety. He stood on your porch, waiting for you to open the door, and for the first time, he didn't look like he was trying to sell you a narrative. He just looked like a man who was finally breathing the air of reality. "Martha," he said, his voice level, "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted to tell you personally. My mother, she had a stroke 3 nights ago. She's in the hospital in Richmond." You felt a ripple of something in your heart, not grief, but a profound sense of the inevitable. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mark. How is she?" Mark leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the woods. "She's stable, but she's lost the ability to speak. The doctors say the damage to the part of the brain that controls communication is significant. She understands what's happening, she can see us, but she can't give orders anymore. She can't rewrite the story." The irony was absolute. The woman who had used her voice as a weapon, who had spent decades manipulating the records of others, was now trapped in a permanent silence. It was a physical manifestation of the emotional withdrawal you had already enacted. "Why are you telling me this, Mark?" you asked softly. "Because she keeps looking at the door," Mark said, his voice breaking. "She looks at every nurse, every doctor, every visitor, as if she's waiting for someone. I think she's waiting for Sarah. Or maybe she's waiting for you. I think she's finally realized that the silence she built is a very lonely place to live." You looked at Mark and saw the struggle in his eyes. He was still the son of Evelyn Turner, and the pull of the old loyalty was still there, but it was being tempered by a new understanding. He wasn't asking you to bring Sarah back to the cage. He was asking for a kind of mercy that he didn't even know how to define. "Sarah is 8 months pregnant, Mark," you said, your voice firm. "She has spent this year learning how to breathe without the weight of that house on her chest. I won't ask her to go back into that hospital room and look at a woman who tried to erase her, not even for a final apology." "I know," Mark said, nodding slowly. "I didn't come here to force her. I thought you should know. I've spent the last 3 days sitting by her bed, and all I can think about is my father. I keep thinking about that drugstore notebook you found. I look at her now, unable to move, unable to speak, and I realize that she's experiencing exactly what she forced him to endure. It's a terrifying kind of justice, Martha." This was the awareness finally reaching its peak for Mark. He was seeing the full circle of the calculated indifference. He was realizing that his mother hadn't just been difficult. She had been the architect of her own isolation. "What are you going to do, Mark?" "I've closed the foundation," he said, and the words seemed to lift a weight off his shoulders. "I've donated the remaining funds to the State Historical Society to create a permanent archive for the records you've been working on, the stories of the unnamed. I'm selling the estate. I can't live there anymore. Every room feels like a museum of things that never happened." You felt a sudden, sharp sense of closure. The Turner estate, the monument to silence, was being dismantled. The legacy was being returned to the people it had excluded. "That's a good start, Mark," you said. He looked at you, and for a moment you saw the man Sarah had fallen in love with, the one who wanted to be kind before he was taught to be a Turner. "I'm moving to Seattle. I have a job offer at a firm there. I need to be somewhere where the name Turner doesn't mean anything. I need to learn how to be a person, not a legacy." He stayed for tea, and though the conversation was quiet and guarded, it was honest. When Sarah came home from school, she saw him sitting at the kitchen table. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She simply walked over, placed her hand on her stomach, and looked at him with a pity that was far more devastating than anger. Mark stood up, his eyes resting on her. "You look beautiful, Sarah. Truly." "I'm happy, Mark," she said, and the simplicity of the statement was absolute. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am." Mark told her about Evelyn. Sarah listened in silence, her face unreadable. When he finished, she didn't offer to go to the hospital. She didn't offer words of forgiveness. She simply nodded. "I hope she finds peace, Mark," Sarah said. "But I can't give it to her. I only have enough peace for myself and this baby right now. I can't carry her silence anymore." It was the ultimate act of emotional withdrawal. Sarah wasn't being cruel. She was being healthy. She was recognizing that her responsibility to her own well-being and the well-being of her child outweighed the cultural expectation of a reconciliation that would only serve to reopen the wounds. After Mark left, you and Sarah sat in the garden. The rain had stopped, and the air was filled with the scent of damp pine and wood smoke. "Do you think I'm being cold, Mom?" Sarah asked, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "No, honey," you said. "I think you're being clear. You spent 3 years and 7 months being warm and kind and accommodating, and all it did was nearly destroy you. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, Sarah. It's self-sacrifice, and you've done enough of that." "I feel sorry for her," Sarah whispered. "I really do. To have lived such a long life, and to have no one left who truly loves you. To be surrounded by things and titles, but to be absolutely alone in your own mind. It's a horrible way to end." "It is," you said, "but it's the life she chose. She chose to be a monument instead of a person, and monuments are always cold, Sarah. They're always lonely." The months that followed were filled with the quiet, urgent preparations for the baby. You were no longer just an archivist of the past. You were the architect of a new future. You helped Sarah paint the small room that would be the nursery, not in the muted, refined colors Evelyn would have chosen, but in a vibrant, sun-drenched yellow that felt like hope. In late November, Evelyn Turner passed away. She died in the middle of the night, in a room filled with the best medical equipment money could buy, and not a single person by her side. Mark was on a plane to Seattle, and the staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew. It was a quiet end to a loud legacy. There was no grand funeral. At Mark's request, it was a private service, attended only by a few distant relatives and the lawyers who were handling the final dissolution of the estate. You didn't go. Neither did Sarah. Instead, you both spent that afternoon at the local library, where Sarah was volunteering for a children's reading hour. You watched your daughter sit on a small chair, surrounded by kids who didn't care about her last name, and you realized that this was the real memorial, a life lived in the service of the living, not the dead. Mark sent a final letter a week later. He had sold the estate to a land trust that was going to turn the grounds into a public park and the house into a community center. He had included a small box for you, something he had found in the back of Evelyn's personal safe. You opened it in your study. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age. It was a picture of Evelyn as a young woman, perhaps 20 years old. She was standing in her garden, her hair loose, a genuine smile on her face. She looked happy. She looked human. On the back, in a handwriting that was already starting to become stiff and controlled, were the words, "The day I learned how to win." You looked at that young woman and felt a wave of profound sadness. She hadn't been born a monster. She had learned it. She had been taught that life was a competition, that power was the only protection, and that winning meant having more than everyone else. She had spent 50 years perfecting a mask, only to have it become her prison. You didn't put the photograph in your archives. You didn't keep it as a trophy. You walked to the fireplace and watched the flames consume the image of the young Evelyn Turner. You were done with her story. You were done with the reflections of a life lived in shadows. On a cold, clear night in December, Sarah's daughter was born. You were there in the delivery room, holding Sarah's hand as she brought a new generation into the world. When the nurse placed the tiny, crying infant into Sarah's arms, you felt a sense of completion that surpassed anything you had ever felt in your career. "She's beautiful, Mom," Sarah whispered, her face glowing with a light that no Turner could ever dim. "She is, Sarah," you said, "and she's free." You named her Maya, a name that meant illusion in some cultures, but to you, it meant the end of illusions. She was a child of the valley, a child of the truth. She would grow up in a cottage filled with books and laughter and the smell of cedar. She would know her grandmother's stories, but she would never have to carry the weight of the archives. The winter passed in a blur of diapers, lullabies, and the soft, sweet smell of a newborn. Mark sent a gift from Seattle, a handmade wooden cradle, with a note that simply said, "For the future." You kept the cradle, but you didn't reply. The withdrawal was complete. The boundaries were set. In the spring, your book on the unnamed was published. It wasn't a bestseller in the traditional sense, but it became a foundational text for the local historical society. You were invited to speak at a university in Richmond, and for a moment, you thought about the Gala, about the woman who told you that you had no right to stand there. You stood on the stage in the grand auditorium, looking out at a sea of young faces, students who were eager to learn about the truth of their own history. You didn't wear pearls. You didn't wear a designer suit. You wore a simple linen dress and the confidence of a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to speak. "History isn't just about the people who owned the houses," you told them, your voice clear and steady. "It's about the people who lived in the gaps. It's about the voices that were silenced so that others could feel powerful. And it's our job, as keepers of the record, to make sure those voices are finally heard." As you spoke, you felt the presence of your own life, the 40 years of silence, the 3 years of endurance, and the final, glorious awareness of your own worth. You realized that your love for Sarah hadn't been a blindness after all. It had been a catalyst. By protecting her, you had finally learned how to protect yourself. The reception after the lecture was crowded. People came up to you, shaking your hand, asking questions about your research. In the middle of the crowd, you saw a woman who looked familiar, an old acquaintance from the Charlottesville social circles, someone who had been at the gala that night. "Martha," she said, her voice hesitant, "I read your book. It's very moving. I had no idea about some of those stories." "Most people don't," you said politely. "We only see what we're allowed to see." The woman looked down at her hands. "I'm so sorry about everything that happened with Evelyn. We all knew she was difficult, but we didn't say anything. We thought it was just the way things were." You looked at her and felt no anger, only a mild, distant curiosity. "Silence is a choice, Helen, just like speaking is. We all have to live with the choices we make." You walked away from her and toward Sarah, who was waiting by the door with Maya in her arms. Your daughter looked at you and winked, a quick, playful gesture that told you everything you needed to know. The archives were closed. The legacy was rewritten. As you drove home through the Virginia hills, the sun setting behind the mountains in a blaze of violet and orange, you felt a sense of absolute, unshakable peace. You were 69 years old, and you were finally living in the present. You were no longer looking for the gaps in other people's lives. You were filling the space in your own. You arrived at the cottage and saw the garden coming back to life. The tulips and daffodils you and Sarah had planted together were pushing through the soil, bold and bright. You walked up the steps and sat on your porch, listening to the sounds of the woods and the quiet hum of your daughter's voice from inside. You realized that this was the new horizon the original framework had promised. It wasn't a place of victory or power. It was a place of clarity. It was the realization that your value didn't come from the names you cataloged or the houses you entered, but from the truth you carried in your own heart. You thought of the calculated indifference that had once threatened to consume your family. It was gone now, replaced by a calculated presence, a conscious decision to be awake, to be honest, and to be kind. You closed your eyes and breathed in the cool spring air. You were Martha, an archivist of the truth. You had moved through the pain, endured the silence, found the awareness, and withdrawn into a life of your own making. The story of the Turners was over. The story of the archives was over. But the story of your life, the real one, was just beginning. And in that realization, the silence wasn't a cage anymore. It was a sanctuary. The record was finally complete. And for the first time in your life, you didn't need to write another word. You were home. The morning light in Charlottesville now felt like a familiar friend, no longer the harsh judge of your worth, but a soft witness to your peace. It had been nearly 3 years since the night of the gala, and the world had turned over many times since then. You sat on your porch, the wood seasoned by the Virginia seasons, watching Maya run through the tall grass of the meadow. She was 3 years old now, a whirlwind of sun-bleached hair and unfiltered laughter. She didn't walk, she danced, her small feet finding the rhythm of a world that was entirely hers. Watching her, you realized that the greatest achievement of your life wasn't the books you had restored or the archives you had organized. It was the fact that Maya didn't know how to be silent. She didn't know that some people used their voices to build walls, or that some houses were built on the bones of unspoken truths. To her, a voice was for singing, for asking why, and for calling out to the people who loved her without a shred of doubt. Sarah was in the kitchen, the window open to catch the spring breeze. You could hear the clatter of breakfast dishes and the soft hum of a melody she had picked up from one of her students. She had been promoted to lead teacher at the Valley School, a role she had accepted not with the frantic ambition of a Turner, but with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The endurance that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a calculated presence, a way of being in the world that was fully awake and unapologetically honest. She had reclaimed her history, and in doing so, she had ensured that Maya would never have to carry the weight of a legacy that wasn't hers. Your book, The Unnamed, had become more than just a historical text. It had become a catalyst for a broader conversation about memory and power in Virginia. The State Library had officially opened the Turner-funded archive, and to your surprise, they had insisted on naming the reading room after you. You had initially refused, the old instinct to remain in the shadows still flickering in the back of your mind. But Sarah had looked at you, her eyes bright and clear, and said, "Mom, if you don't put your name on it, someone else will eventually try to rewrite why it exists. Your name is the boundary." So you had accepted. You were no longer just a footnote. You were the title page. The final chapter of the Turner saga began on a quiet Thursday afternoon in May. A letter arrived in the mail, not from a lawyer or a firm, but a simple envelope with a Seattle postmark. It was from Mark. He had been living in the Pacific Northwest for 2 years now, and the reports you had heard from mutual acquaintances were consistently positive. He was a partner at a different kind of firm, one that specialized in environmental law, and he had become a quiet advocate for elder rights on the side. "Martha," the letter began, "I'm writing this from a coffee shop overlooking the Sound. The air here is cold and gray, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I can see. I've spent the last year in a kind of internal archive, going through the records of my own childhood, trying to find where the silence started. I realized that my mother didn't just manipulate my father. She manipulated the very idea of what love was supposed to look like. She made it look like a transaction, a prize to be won by being the best, the most refined, the most obedient. I'm writing to tell you that I finally sold the last of the Turner assets. The money has been moved into a trust for Sarah and the baby, not as a settlement and not with any conditions. It's just their portion of a history that should have been shared a long time ago. I don't expect a reply, and I don't expect to be part of your lives. I just needed to tell you that the cage is officially dismantled. I'm learning how to stand on my own ground, too." You read the letter twice, then handed it to Sarah. She read it while leaning against the kitchen counter, Maya tugging at her skirt, demanding to be picked up. Sarah finished the letter and let out a long, slow breath. She didn't look at the check that was mentioned, a sum that was likely $4,236,000 after the final liquidation. She just looked at the words. "He sounds like a person now," Sarah whispered. "Not a role, just a person. He had to lose everything to find the truth, Sarah, you said. Just like we did. I don't want the money, Mom, Sarah said, her voice firm. I want to donate it to the school. We could build a library, a real one, for everyone. I think that's a beautiful way to rewrite the legacy, Sarah, you replied. From a private prison to a public library, it's the ultimate archivist's revenge. As the weeks passed, you found yourself reflecting on the latent emotional mechanism that had guided you through this journey. You had lived through the pain of the Gala, the long, grinding endurance of the years prior, the sharp, sudden awareness of the truth, and the final, necessary, emotional withdrawal. But there was a fifth phase that the framework hadn't named, the transformation. It was the moment when the silence stopped being a sanctuary of safety and became a sanctuary of peace. You realized that your life had always been a series of reflections. You had spent 40 years reflecting the needs of your husband, your daughter, and your clients. You had been a mirror for everyone else's expectations. But in the silence of your cottage, surrounded by the woods and the laughter of your granddaughter, you were finally reflecting yourself. You were no longer an observer of history. You were the protagonist of your own life. The final archival discovery happened in June, as you were packing up the last of your personal research files to donate to the university. You found a folder you had forgotten, a collection of letters you had recovered from the very first crate Evelyn had given you, the ones she had labeled as historical fluff. Among them was a single, unposted letter from Thomas Turner, dated 3 months before he died. It wasn't addressed to Mark or Evelyn. It was addressed to the person who finds this. You sat at your desk, the afternoon sun warming your shoulders, and you read the words of a man who had known exactly what was happening to him. I am writing this in a moment of clarity, the letter began. The fog comes and goes, but today I can see the walls. Evelyn thinks I don't know. She thinks because I can't find the words, I've lost the thoughts. But I see the way she looks at me. I see the calculated indifference she uses to manage my decline. She is waiting for me to disappear so she can finally own the story. I don't hate her. I feel a terrible pity for her. She has spent her life building a fortress out of her own fears, and she doesn't realize that a fortress is just a tomb with a better view. To the person who finds this, don't let the archives be a prison. Use the truth to set the living free. My legacy isn't the money or the name. It's the truth of how a man can be erased by the person who claims to love him. Don't let it happen to anyone else. You felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air in the room. You realized that Thomas Turner had known you were coming. He hadn't known your name, but he had known that eventually, an archivist, someone who looked for the gaps, would find the truth. He had left you a map, and you had followed it without even knowing it. You didn't cry. You felt a sense of profound, solemn duty. You had fulfilled the last request of a man you had never truly known. You had used the truth to set the living free. You had taken Sarah out of that fortress and brought her into the sun. You walked out to the garden where Sarah and Maya were planting sunflowers. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and warm earth. Maya was trying to dig a hole with a plastic spoon, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes focused with an intensity that reminded you of yourself. "Mom, you okay?" Sarah asked, looking up. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I've just finished the last piece of the puzzle, Sarah," you said, sitting down on the grass beside them. "The archives are officially closed. There are no more secrets." You spent the rest of the afternoon in the dirt, helping your granddaughter plant seeds for a future she would never have to defend. You realized that the moral awareness you had gained wasn't just about knowing right from wrong. It was about the courage to act on that knowledge when everyone else was choosing the comfort of silence. You had been the archivist of the Turners' shame, but now you were the gardener of Sarah's joy. The emotional withdrawal from the Turners was now so complete that you could mention their names without a single ripple of bitterness. They were just people in a history book, tragic figures who had mistaken power for love and reputation for character. You felt a strange sense of gratitude for Evelyn Turner. Without her cruelty, you might never have found your own strength. Without her calculated indifference, you might never have learned the value of a calculated presence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and bruised gold, you sat on your porch one last time. Maya was asleep in the hammock, her thumb in her mouth, her breathing slow and even. Sarah was sitting on the steps, looking at the stars as they began to blink into existence. "I think I'm going to write a second book, Mom," Sarah said suddenly. "Oh? What about?" "About the school," she said. "About what happens when you tell children that their voices matter. I want to call it the sound of the present, because the present is the only thing we actually own." You smiled, a deep, satisfied smile that felt like it had been decades in the making. "I think that's a perfect title, Sarah, and I think you're the only person who can write it." You leaned back in your chair and closed your eyes. You were 70 years old, and you were finally undeniably home. You had moved through the pain of the Gala, the endurance of the years in the archives, the awareness of the truth, and the withdrawal from the shadows. You had become the keeper of the light. The silence of the cottage wasn't a cage anymore. It was a song. It was the sound of a family that had been broken and rebuilt, not with pearls and legacies, but with honesty and love. It was the sound of a mother who had saved her daughter and a daughter who had saved herself. You thought about the $150,000 you had turned into a paper crane. It was still there on the shelf, a small white bird of peace sitting next to Thomas Turner's notebook. It was a reminder that your silence couldn't be bought, and your truth couldn't be erased. The record was complete, the archives were organized, the history was told. And as you sat there in the quiet of the Virginia night, you realized that the most important word in any archive isn't legacy or heritage or power, or that the most important word is now. You were here, you were awake, and you had every right to stand. The final chapter wasn't a tragedy or a victory. It was simply the truth, and the truth was more than enough. You took a deep breath of the cool night air, the scent of the pines and the earth filling your lungs. You looked at your daughter, at your sleeping granddaughter, and at the small, quiet world you had fought so hard to protect. You were no longer an archivist of the past. You were the author of the future, and for the first time in your life, you were completely, perfectly at peace. The story was over, but the life was just beginning, and in that realization, the archives were finally, beautifully silent. You stayed on the porch long after Sarah and Maya had gone inside. The moon rose high over the hills, casting a silver glow over the garden. You thought about all the people you had cataloged over the years, the famous, the infamous, and the unnamed. You realized that every one of them was just a collection of moments, a series of choices made in the dark. You had made your choices in the light, and as you walked inside and closed the door, you felt the weight of the past finally lift from your shoulders, disappearing into the night like wood smoke.